Okay, today is actually, we're right in the middle of Yom Kippurim. We had our Holy Assembly last night as the sun was going down and had a good time with that. Uh, the the whole point in Yom Kippurim is this is a time where we're supposed to look inside into our very soul, the part of us that lives on after we're gone, and get real with ourselves. Am I running around pretending to be someone that I'm not? If so, I need to stop doing that. Am I going around telling people I'm going to do things and then don't? Am I going around lying to people? Am I coveting other people's stuff? These are the kind of things that we need to look into our lives and get real with ourselves. And the beauty of this is the moment in the year where, Kippurim coverings, those who dwell in the secret place of the Most High, there's no more Kippurim than that, under the wing of God. We read that, and it's the word literally for feather. It's not really the word for wing, but we get the idea of, feathers from that. But this is, there's a story in the Bible, and most people know this woman as Ruth, Ruth. Her name was not Ruth. Her name was Root. It should be transliterated in English as R-U-T, or it could be transliterated R-O-O-T. Maybe people would pronounce it more correctly that way. But there was a woman named Ruth, and she was married to a man, and her mother-in-law, her name was Naomi, not Naomi, Naomi. And Naomi and her husband and her two grown sons left Jerusalem, which is what Jerusalem used to be called. They call it Yerushalayim now, but biblically speaking, it's Jerusalem. And they left in the middle of a horrendous drought. There was no water, there was no food. Well, I shouldn't say no, but it was getting scarce. And so Elimelech, Naomi's husband, leased out his house and his land and to someone else because he needed some cash. Because this was one of those things you can't actually sell, right? Because we're right in the middle of learning about the year of redemption, where people are buying back that which they did not sell but leased. The word should be these days should be leased. The word sell comes from when it was translated, back in between the 12 and say 1600s, and it just kind of stuck. And it probably had that idea of lease with it back then. I'm not saying that's, you have to know this about translation. Our language, every language, changes over time. The meanings of words change over time. The uses and the way the words are applied. There was a time where if somebody said, that's really cool, the other person would have taken that to mean that's cold. And then over time, people started saying that's cool to mean, I don't know, how else would you say that now? Back in my time, we would have said groovy. But that's awesome. They will say awesome. And then the word cool, that was only connected to the idea of cold, became something completely different. And you just can't imagine how many of our words, the word jealous, back when the English Bibles were translated, was not connected to the idea of a jealous lover. I shouldn't say it wasn't, but it did have that connotation in one place in the Bible. But it was used the way we would now use the word zealous, to be excited about something. Yes, jealous was used that way back then. Not so much anymore, right? So now when people go in and they read that God is a jealous God, they think he's petty. Oprah Winfrey freaked out. She was in a church getting all ready, went there early and got all set up and whatever. The way I forget, I remember the way she described the scene. She got there early and just, I don't know, was putting up pillows and whatever. It seemed like I got the idea that she took a long time to get all set up for her little church experience. And the preacher gets up there and tells her that God is jealous. Now, she admittedly, by her own words, was not terribly paying attention. And she heard this and thought, wait, what? Why would God be jealous of me? Well, that's a good question. Why would he be jealous of any of us? He created us. How do you get jealous of something you created? Of something that you can both give and take life from? I mean, really? Well, and from that, she left the church, went on this long journey, found this guru dude, and led literally millions of people astray. Come on. That's what happened. She's still in the wrong place because somebody did not understand their Bible very well, and because they based it on the words in English that meant something to that person in that moment that it did not mean when that book was translated. As far as I'm concerned, every Bible in every language should be retranslated a minimum of every 60 years because the language changes that much. So no, there is no translation of the Bible anywhere, whether it's the Jewish Bible, what the Christians call the Old Testament. That translation is not worth the paper it's written on. New Testament, oh, but Rob, we've got all these brand new Jewish study Bible, New Testament thingamabobs. I don't even know what they call those. I've looked over most of them. And no, they're junk because they're taking modern Judaism, and modern Judaism, the Judaism we know of today, comes from the Dark Ages. And most of what we think is Jewish was stolen from the Catholic Church. Yes, that is a fact. Oh, well, what are you going to do? They're going in there in these new Jewish Bibles and talking about the fringe and how it's all knotted and all the knots and stuff mean that. No, that stuff didn't exist until Maimon wrote his stuff in the 1200s of our era, of the current era. You couldn't have had the knots and the twists before that. Somebody had to lay it all out first, and that was Maimon who did that. It was suggested in the 600s by R. Simlai. He said that, the numbers to God's name equal 613. Therefore, there should only be 613 laws. It was just an idea he tossed out there, and nothing was done with it. Then in the 900s, somebody actually came along. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. He came along and actually laid out, 613? Yeah, 613 laws. And then Maimon comes in the 1200s, and he lays them out again, and they don't match the earlier one. And he didn't come up with 613 laws either. If he'd had a computer, he might have pulled it off. But he's got repeat laws where the Hebrew text, right down to the vowel pointing that was added to it way after the fact, all of it was identical. That's not two different laws just because it's in two different places. No, it's not. And he did that. He counted the same law 2 and even 3 times. So no, he didn't come up with 613 either. And it's nonsensical in the first place. It's just it's a silly idea. But you had to have it set up the way Maimon set it up before you could start doing okay, we're going to make so many knots and so many twists in between the knots to represent the 613 laws. No, that doesn't come until after Maimon, not before. So it being in the New Testament, no, it shouldn't be there. The blessed are you, Lord God, creator of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. There's no evidence that anyone ever said those words in the first century. That comes from Dark Ages as well. Did they give a blessing? Yeah, they lifted the bread and gave a blessing. We know that from more than just the New Testament letters. It was spoken of. The problem is no one ever told us what the words were. Why? Well, because everybody back then knew what the words were. Just like today, we know what we say now. Is it the same thing they said? It's possible, but not very probable. Is it close? That's most likely. It's most likely very close to what we say now. But then again, we have no proof of that. So maybe it's not even close. We don't know. So all these things change. The meanings of the words change over time. And that changes your understanding of those words. And then when you translate the translators of the New Testament that say it's a Jewish translation, if you don't recognize the Hebrew dialect that was spoken in the first century Jerusalem area, you're never going to get a good translation of that Greek text. And if you have that Greek text and you have not stripped it of all of its punctuation, you sure are not going to get the right translation. Because when you get a Greek text that has punctuation marks in it, you have a translation. You're not using the Greek text, you're using a translation of the Greek text. Somebody, once you start putting commas and periods and question marks in your text, that's a translation. For instance, there is a verse in the Hebrew Bible, and it says something like, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Lord will lift a standard against him. Okay, now wait a minute. What if your text has a comma in it? When the enemy comes in like a flood, comma, so what do you have? At this point, without thinking about the rest of the sentence, when the enemy comes in like a flood, so it's the enemy coming in like a flood, comma, the Lord will lift up a standard against him. So if the enemy's just kind of picking on you, God's not going to do a dang thing for you because it's got to be like a flood before he stands against it, right? That's what it would say. That's what it would mean, right? What if you took the comma and moved it? When the enemy comes in, comma, the Lord will lift up a standard against him. So now if he's even just being nitpicky, God's going to hit him hard like a flood. See what's happening here? When you're going by when you're translating and you're translating from a text that has already put the comma in there, for one, you don't know that the translator who did that had any clue where that comma should have gone. If that translator saw God as petty and jealous and he turned his back on his people back at Sinai, or maybe, in the second temple period, depends on who you ask, when the Jews feel like God turned his back on his people. If you see God as jealous and petty and those sort of things, you're going to put your comma to make it so that the enemy's coming in like a flood. If on the other hand, God is zealous instead of jealous for his people, you're probably going to put your comma over in the front part where God's going after him. Both are wrong. That's not how Hebrew works. The comma actually, in English thought, favors the devil, right? Because he's going to come in like a flood. And it's okay. It's okay to put your comma there. It is correct. But what you need to know, the reason why the Bible tells you to get a teacher, yeah, it tells you that more than once. I'm not making it up. Google it, buddy. I don't know if that's a good idea, Googling religious stuff. But anyway, the comma goes that way because in Hebrew, if God is going to lift up a standard against the enemy when he comes in like a flood, how much more will God go after him when he's just picking on you a little bit? That's how Hebrew works. Bible, Hebrew. So in that case, the comma's kind of actually in our favor, right? Even though in English it seems to be in the bonehead's favor. Get it? So you need to know the rules. See, that's one of the other problems with translating your Bible. The rules disappeared. Because when the Bible was written, there were no such things as punctuation. We didn't have commas and question marks, and periods, and colons and semicolons, and explanation marks, and that sort of thing. That didn't exist. In fact, in the earlier stuff, there weren't even spaces between the words. I'm serious. No spaces. So no spaces, no dots and dashes, because if you look at pretty much any Torah scroll or printed version as a book, it's going to have all these little dots and dashes everywhere. So the very first word in the Bible is Bereshit, right? So you have the bait, and it has two polka dots underneath it and one polka dot in the middle of the vait, right? It's actually a vait without the polka dot. So you put the polka dot, instead of saying V like victory, you say B like boy by putting that polka dot in there. Now the double polka dot below it is be. It's a skipping sound. It's not a BE sound. It's a skipping be. Well, it sounds like a BE to me. But I being from Texas, I slow everything down and it comes out like a BE sound, but that's actually a skipping sound. So you have that, right? And then Bereshit. So now you have a resh, so we make that an R in English. Blah, 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 right? So all those little polka dots tell you how to say that word, right? Because maybe if you don't have the polka dots and the dashes and the dots, you'll say varoshot. You could, right? Because that's why they put the polka dots and stuff in there, so you would know what vowel sound to add, where to make the skipping sound in your voice. That was the whole point. The problem was, and this wasn't done till just roughly 100 years before the Masoretic, well, right up to the time of the Masoretic. It's the product of what they did. So you got between 900 and 1,000 years ago. Well, no, 1,000 and 1,100 years ago. I'm coming the wrong way in history in my mind. But back 1,000 to 1,100, 100 years before that, you've got this group. They're called the Masoretes now. I don't know what they were called back then. Who knows? They came up with this vowel pointing system to help people who essentially were illiterate to have a little bit better way to learn Hebrew. I'll tell you now that I learned it that way, started off with the vowel pointing system. I can't do that anymore. That's too confusing to me. I need the vowel points gone. I can read it just fine without them. I get confused with them. So anyway, they came up with this system and put all these dots and these dashes, but there's no book that gives us the reasons why these dots and these dashes are there. Obviously, somebody knew what it was when it began, but over time that has broken down. And now they try to give you these hard and fast rules, but there's anywhere from 1 to 20 exceptions to that rule, because people who added those dots and dashes didn't follow the rules, is what probably happened. So where you would think, okay, I've got my hard and fast rules. I know if there's polka dots here, I'm supposed to make a skipping sound. And then you get your polka dots in the next word, and in a couple of books later, and you are no longer making the skipping sound because they've taken away the polka dots and put a dash in there. So it's like, why'd they do that? Well, I don't know. Let's make up a new rule for that exception. So all of the rules for why those dots and dashes are there are very convoluted. I tried for almost 3 years to write a program that could, I put all of these rules and all of these exceptions to the rules, and there wasn't one time when any individual rule did not violate another. And any individual exception to an individual rule would violate several other rules and exceptions. It couldn't be done. The computer cannot think that way. The computer is logical. You have to give it its logic. And when the logic argues against itself, breaks its own rules, your computer can't handle that. I had to give up after a while. There was just no way to get the computer to do that. I mean, I could go in and take every single word individually, put that in a database, and set my own rules to every individual word. But holy cow, I would, 40 years later, I'd still be working on that project. No thanks. So there's a man, Umberto Cassuto, was like Moshe Umberto Cassuto, maybe one or two other names. He had a lot of names. Cassuto, C-A-S-U-T-T-O, I think is how it's spelled. I haven't seen his name spelled out in a while. He was a professor at the Hebrew University for a number of years, and he was, during his lifetime, without any doubt, the world's leading authority on the Ugaritic text. Well, once he took that as far as I suppose he could, he then started working on the Torah and discovered, oh my goodness, this is written in the exact same writing style as the Ugaritic text, as the, what do they call that? The epic poem, the Gilgamesh and that sort of thing. All written in exactly the same style, using the known grammar rules of the Ugaritic text. In other words, Cassuto discovered not all, but a great deal of the actual grammar rules used when the Torah, when the part of the Bible written by Moshe himself, when Moshe wrote that down, he was following the rules of Ugaritic text, which makes it possible that he actually wrote it in that language. Now, he, by his own admission, did not speak Hebrew or Greek, Coptic, the Mitzrayim, who is Egypt. Sorry, I could not think of that word. He grew up as a slave to a slave, not the beloved child of the Ramsey guy, like in the movie. Oh, good Lord. No, he was a slave to an actual, he was a slave to a slave. Think about that. So we don't know what language he wrote it in because we've never seen it. And no, it did not have to be written in Hebrew. There are no laws in God's law that said that his law had to be written in Hebrew. It doesn't exist. It's not likely to have been written in Coptic, that's for sure, because, I mean, that's the first thing out of his mouth when God said, hey, I'm going to have you lead the people out. He's like, but Lord, I don't speak that language very well. And that comes out, I'm slow of tongue. And the next thing you know, the Christians are all saying, see there, Moses, he was a stutterer. No. You would say that of a stutterer, that he's slow of tongue. But slow of tongue does not mean you're a stutterer. It means you don't speak the language very well. And a slave of a slave would have learned just enough of that language to obey whatever commands are given. So basically, his grasp on the Coptic language was sit, stay, fetch, because basically he was a dog. Treated like one, trained like one, and that's all the language he would have learned of their language. He was not to speak unless spoken to. And that wouldn't have happened very often, other than a command being given. The idea of an Egyptian anywhere sitting down and having a meaningful conversation with a slave to an Egyptian slave is ridiculous. It just wouldn't have happened. So he comes out of that land. He doesn't speak any language very well at all, unless his mother snuck some Hebrew in there. And yes, he knew he was a Hebrew from the very earliest of age, because the color of his skin was vastly different than the color of the Egyptians. Get what I'm saying? The Egyptians were taller. They were much darker. Because of the Egyptians of his time, they were not olive-skinned Arab-looking people of today. They were dark, black-skinned Africans of their time. They were black people, and not the lighter color like we have in America because of all the mixing of the white with the black people. That's what caused that. These were a purely dark black. The skin just would have been absolutely stunning. You know, I mean, all you have to do is see the skin of somebody from Africa that's truly, their family has not mixed at any time. That's the prettiest skin you've ever seen. But those were the Egyptians. Moshe was light olive skinned. His hair may have been curly, if he had it at all, because, you know, there was one tribe of Jews that was pretty much bald up here. He could have been, you know, I don't know. I don't remember which tribe got that. Probably not the Levites, so he probably did have hair, but who knows? Just because you're a Levite doesn't mean that you don't have other tribe blood in you. Just saying. Anyway, we don't know what language he wrote this in, because he goes off to Midian. Those weren't Jews. They were people from Midian, and he marries the daughter of the priest of Midian, not a Jewish priest. Those didn't exist back then. And we don't know what language they spoke in Midian. And you can see why Moshe would have been pretty hesitant when God said, hey, I'm going to send you. Oh, but wait, I can barely speak to these people. You can understand it, right? So God picked the most unqualified man that could ever have lived. Moshe was a coward. I mean, a chicken little crybaby coward. He was a tiny man. He would not have had a great education. He would not have walked like a king. None of that. That's all folklore. Not even remotely close to who this man was. Because this was all about the power of God. This was all about God coming to take what belonged to him, his people. He had made a promise to Abraham, and he had shown up to take care of that, and he picked the one guy that could not take the glory from God. We need to know these things before we start trying to understand and especially teach the Bible, right? So it's important that you don't just try to translate the Bible in such a way that it matches up with your modern understanding. And it takes a lot of time to come up with a way to show that. My translation keeps the original words with the original image and gives you a new word you can use now. But you got to always go back to the original word, say 60 years after I'm gone and the book's been around a while, and assuming anyone reads it, there's got to be some things here that we know. So when we start talking about Yom Kippurim, we have to realize, first off, what are we basing it on? Are we basing it on what we know from the Bible? For instance, Ruth, when she returned to Jerusalem, well, she didn't return. That was her first time there. But when Naomi, her mother-in-law, returns to Jerusalem, people still recognize her. She's been gone a long time. And, is this Naomi? Yeah, all right, she's back. The prodigal daughter has returned. Yeah, that's kind of what it was like, right? I just recently translated. I'm telling you, it's like the story of the prodigal son. Only in this case, it's the woman coming back. And they have some customs, part of which came right out of the Bible and part of which did not. Now, if we take the customs that are used in that story and try to push them into the New Testament, we have to know what part comes from the actual Bible and what comes from their time period, because maybe in their wedding customs, they weren't the same at that time. I mean, there for a while, you had people going around from church to church teaching people about all of these essential oils that they get out of the story of Esther. Oh my goodness. Esther was in Persia. The oils that she was using and the ceremonial stuff that she did was Persian, not biblical. And they had Christians buying that stuff by the truckload because they wanted to be more biblical. And that's about as far from biblical as you can get. So we have to know the things that we're connecting from modern times or from the wrong culture or from the wrong time period. We have to know which ones should be added and which ones should be not added. We have to know, what did that word mean to them in that time, and what did it mean to us in our time? The word Godhead is not in the New Testament anywhere. There is no Greek word for Godhead. If there is, it wasn't used in the New Testament. Let me put it that way. No Godhead. There is no Trinity at all. Neither in the Old Testament, as that's called by the Christians, nor in the New Testament. It's not there. It comes from people not knowing what they're talking about. Kepa, the guy they called Peter, warned his followers not to follow people who didn't know what they were doing. It's the reason why it took so long for those who put together, these are the official canonized letters that we're going to call the New Testament. That doesn't happen until the 400s. Kind of happened before that because Jerome had translated what he could find into the Latin language that nobody of his time spoke unless you were an elitist like him. And so, someone like Constantine certainly would have spoken it, probably not very well, but he would have spoken it. He would have been able to read it. Jerome certainly did. He was an elitist as well. But the average person didn't speak that language, which is why it was chosen. And then all your New Testament, they'll tell you that the New Testament of the King James was translated from the Greek text of Erasmus. And then you go back and you look at Erasmus and realize he just translated the Latin into Greek, and that's all he did. So you don't have a New Testament that was actually translated from an original Greek for couple of reasons, and the main one is we don't have an original Greek. And it would help if you understood that Hebrew-speaking Jewish men did not write their letters in the Greek language. They wrote them in Hebrew. And it was all based, the entire New Testament corpus as it was picked, all of that stuff was based on what the Christians call the Old Testament. And you cannot possibly understand what you're reading if you don't know the laws that all of that stuff comes from. Every single doctrine that is in the New Testament, there's nothing new. Why they call it the new, especially when Yirmiyahu said there would be a new sacrifice. But Bereshit, or what am I saying? Oh, Lord. Berit, that's the actual word I meant to say. That went from meaning to chop up an animal for the purpose of cooking it to covenant, which in the early days, there was no difference. You couldn't have a covenant unless you chopped up an animal, and you couldn't have a slaying without it being a covenant, because that was just one thing. It wasn't two different things. That was one thing. So if there was something written, it was not called the covenant. It was called the witness of the covenant. The witness. It was not the covenant. It was the witness of the covenant. So Yirmiyahu says, in English, it gets so horribly translated, that there's this new covenant, and it's for Israel. It's somehow Israel gets kicked out and this new religion gets put in its place. Really? Really? Holy smokes. So I really wanted to talk today about, obviously I'm not going to get into the other stuff, about the customs and the culture of the New Testament times. And because people are wanting to get, when they get married, they want to get married the way, they did in the biblical times. Okay, we don't know a lot about that. And most of what we know is going to come from the New Testament, because it's the only place that you can find actual descriptions of some of the things that happened. You jump from the first century, when that stuff took place and was written about, to the 300s. That's where the actual documentation that we have of the first century time. You're skipping 300 years there, because we don't have anything that was written before that. Now, there's people that say, oh, yeah, this little sliver here and this little sliver here was written in the 150s or so. Okay, it's a sliver. It's not the book of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John or whatever. No, it's talking about a sliver. And here's the problem I have with it. How is it that on this side of that little sliver, you have the beginning of a sentence, and when you flip it over, there's the other part of the same sentence? Really? Do you not get what I just said? It wouldn't be like that. It would be part of a completely different book, most likely. Think about that. You write out Matthew chapter 1, verse 4. You're on the whatever line of your, you're writing it on a piece of paper, and there's all these lines, you're just writing it on what do you call that kind of paper? I don't even remember anymore. Notebook. Yeah, let's call it that. Notebook paper, right? So, and you're writing down your copy of Matthew. Is there any chance that chapter 1, verse 4 is any part of that's going to be, when you flip that piece of paper over, it's going to be on the other side? No. You're probably going to be on a different chapter by the time you get to the other side, right? But these slivers, they're saying this, this proves it's on. Turn them over and see the other side. I have. I'm sure there are some that are not, but the ones that they were pushing at the time, and this was, of course, 25, 30 years ago, it was the rest of the same sentence on the other side. That shouldn't have even been accepted as authentic. Anyway. You got to be careful where all this stuff is coming from, right? So we do know that according to the New Testament, I want to say one other thing before I get to that. The stuff that the Messianics are running with on when the Bible was put together, that you're getting really, you're either in or just before the Dark Ages, the documentation they have that's bringing that stuff to light. That's a long way from the first century. That's at least 1,000 years after. The documentation that you get from the first century, for the most part, doesn't even talk about it. But in the New Testament letters, they do talk about things that were very common. They talk about the sound of the trumpet and the best man going before the groom and, yelling out, the bride, behold, the bridegroom comes, go out and meet him. It's something like that. I mean, it's there. We even know what they said back then, right? Of course, now this is 300 years after the fact, so it could have been a little different. Maybe it was exact, maybe it wasn't, but it would have been something close to that. They're blowing trumpets, they're making all kinds of noise, and they're coming in the middle of the night. Well, that's going to wake up the whole village, everybody. So with this idea of God coming back and snatching up his people in the blinking of an eye, and the planes are going to come down out of the sky, in spite of the fact that the New Testament letters say that it's not even possible for God to be the author of confusion. Yeah, read it in Greek. A little different than the English. It says not even possible. Yet we think God's going to snatch up his people and planes are going to fall out of the sky. No. When he comes like a thief in the night, everyone in the village knows he's there. Everyone knows what's about to happen. And when he does get there, they're going to set up a chuppah, which is 4 sticks in the ground. And one of these things that I have on right now, over the top of it, and the groom and the bride are going to stand next to each other underneath that chuppah. They're going to fill a wine glass halfway full, all the way full with glass. He's going to take that and face her and say, something along the lines of, with this cup we enter into Nisawin. Yeah, because we're in the second phase instead of Ederseen starts it and Nisawin finishes it. So we're going to enter into this second phase, and he drinks half the cup. And then he hands the cup to her, and she drinks the second half of the cup. And then they take that chuppah off of those 4 sticks, and it literally would have been 4 sticks stuck in the ground. They take that thing off. It's white, probably solid white. And they take off and head back to the groom's home, because at this point they're fully married. They're going to enter into the consummation phase of their wedding. Now, there's some outside sources that prove that the stories told here in these New Testament letters are in fact correct. Part of it comes right out of the Hebrew Bible, because it's based on the events that took place at Sinai. So it's kind of obvious that that's where it came from. So you do have parts of it that you know for sure they did. The idea of throwing a glass down, wrapping a glass up in a little rag and putting it on the ground and stomping on it, no. No. That doesn't even come from Judaism. I think they stole that from the Russians, if I had to guess, and that is a guess, I don't know. But that is not a Jewish custom. It is now. That's what we do nowadays. But you start putting that in your New Testament, shame on you. You don't know what you're doing. You shouldn't be doing this if you're doing stuff like that. You have to be careful. You cannot understand any part of the Bible unless you know the customs, the culture, the history, and the language of that particular time. So knowing the customs, the culture, and the history at the time of Moshe with what he wrote is great. But if you don't know the customs, the culture, and the history of the time that Yeshayahu wrote his stuff, or Daniel wrote his stuff, because they were different, very different. You have to make sure that what you're connecting your ideas to come from the correct place. So when we celebrate Yom Kippurim, we can bring all of that bridegroom stuff in. That's great. And it definitely has its place. But the main reason behind this celebration, it's all about self-reflection. It's not about going through the day pretending not to eat and pretending to be starving and sneaking off somewhere and getting something to eat like most Jews do. It's not that. And it's not about celebrating the bridegroom coming together and all of that. I mean, yeah, that's all fine and good. As long as you're connecting the right stuff, that's fine. But this is all about us bringing passion to God. And how do we bring passion to God? Well, what is God? He is truth. He is truth. He is truth. So if we're going to bring passion to God, we have to do that in the spirit of truth. We're not possessed by some spirit that's going to leave us hanging one day or be kicked out by some guy with holy water. No. The spirit of truth, we possess that when truth is absolutely important to us. And the way God wants us to get that, to be more like Him, is for us to take that proverbial long look in the mirror and see past the part where we say, oh, I'm so pretty. And see the beyond the mask, beyond the avatar that we put out there for all the world to see. And that innermost truth about us, we bring and lay at God's feet. That brings passion to God. Why? Because when we recognize our failures and we recognize our shortcomings, it's not to tear us down. It's to build us up. Amen. So AA had a few things right back in the day. They've changed a lot since they started, but when they first began, they knew that the first thing that you had to know was the truth. In their case, you had to know you were an alcoholic. In our case, we have to know who we are. We have to accept what we have and have not done. And we have to lay that before our God. Make our apologies if that's necessary. Accept his encouragement if that's what comes, because you're going to be a mix of everything, I would think. But it's very important that we give God this day, that we, probably not a day we ought to be watching football. Probably not a day we ought to be off kayaking. Or this is a day we ought to be concentrating on God. He's asking for one day out of your year for this. He doesn't ask very much. 1 week, starting next week, a whole week. Ooh, so much of your time. One day, Saturday, so much of your time. And he's asking you to rest on that day. Break. Take it easy. Rest your body and your mind. Oh, that's so awful. It's so legalistic. It's so full of bondage. This is the time where there is no veil between us and our God. We lay it all out on the line. And by doing that, God covers us with his wing. Wow. Takes us like root under his blanket. Wow. That's why that story was told, so that we could see it in human terms. Yeah. I've probably taken that as far as I should go today. Shalom, shalom, everybody.
The blessing, vaYiqra. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.